Good morning and welcome to March's installment of our Bench2Market talk series. Today we'll be having a great talk on go-to-market strategy. Our Bench2Market talks are co-sponsored by Biolocity, the Pettit Institute for Bioengineering and Bioscience, and the Georgia CTSA. And I am Courtney Law, the Managing Director of Biolocity. Before we jump into today's talk, I just wanted to share a couple of updates and things that may be of interest to this group, and then I will turn it over to today's speaker. So as I mentioned, we're here for our March talk. We have 3 more talks left for this year, or for this school year. So our next talk will actually be on April 14th about contract law and licensing strategies. You'll be able to register for this talk at our Biolocity website, so biolocity.gatech.edu/bench2market. Again, this talk will be on April 14th and will also be at the same time at 11:30. This should be a great talk. It will be led by Professor Nicole Morris. I want to share a couple other resources that might be of interest to you all around commercialization. So actually, Professor Nicole Morris also works with us and within the School of Law at Emory to provide legal office hours. There are a variety of topics and areas of interest that she's able to discuss with you all. And if you're interested in meeting with her on a one-to-one session, please make an appointment. You can find links to how to make an appointment on the Biolocity website. An additional item that I wanted to share with you all is there is an NIH Tech Accelerator Challenge specifically for maternal health. They are seeking to spur and reward the development of prototypes for low-cost point-of-care diagnostics and devices. You can see on our slide the 4 priority conditions, whether that's infection, hypertensive disease, hemorrhage, or placental issues. Participants who are wishing to compete must register for the challenge by April 1st. So you do have a couple of weeks, but check out their website to learn more. So at venturewell.org/NTAC. Biolocity is a part of the BARDA Drive network, and we're happy to share the most current funding opportunities that are available for either funding or partnership. These opportunities come with up to about $749,000 in awards. And if any of these areas of interest match research that you're working on, please contact our team. We can share we can answer any questions about the application process and connect you with BARDA representatives. So those are all kind of the housekeeping things I wanted to share before introducing today's talk. This talk should be an interactive workshop that will really guide you through the process of setting up commercialization milestones. Our speaker today is Brian Walsh, who is the Managing Director of Innova Group. He's an industry leader with more than 30 years of experience for successfully taking technologies from ideas to the market. He is also an expert in residence with Biolocity. I'm looking forward to today's talk, and I will turn it over to him. We will have time for Q&A at the end, so if you have any questions while he's speaking, please feel free to leave your questions in either the chat or the Q&A box, and I'll make sure that they are asked at the end. And so with that, I will turn it over to Brian.
Great, thank you, Courtney. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Let me share screen. Okay, that should be okay, I think. So I'm going to touch on a couple of points here, and it occurred to me when I was reviewing this presentation, the kind of why this stuff's important is significant here. And the reasons what I'm about to explain to you is important is investors will expect it, and they'll expect it in the way that I'll show it to you. Industry strategics also kind of work in this way and in this style. But probably most importantly, it demonstrates that you're knowledgeable in commercial requirements and processes and are able to kind of speak the industry side of the equation, not just the academic. So I'm going to walk through planning, the differences between academic and industry milestones, value inflection points, which are super important. I think many of you in our earlier conversations, we've pushed on this, and then the concept of the killer experiment. So I just took a super simple example, which is how do you plant a garden? What do you do? What are the tasks that go into that? And kind of lay it out, right? And this is like a really, really basic example. But the important part here is the definition of a plan. So I worked in the Silicon Valley for some years, and there were many things I learned. It's kind of like the MBA on steroids to work in the Silicon Valley. But there's one thing that they burned into my brain is the definition of a plan, which is task, dates, and owners. And so they lay them out like this. And this is a super, super simple concept. But then we want to expand that, right, into something that is more than this. But you'll notice that there's some detail here, and you could address items like cost or what is dependent on what. So for instance, you probably won't want to buy the plants before you select a location because they might die or something like that, right? So the idea here is to get these in this form. This is a Gantt chart. This is what industry uses. And there's other types of ways of communicating a plan, but this is pretty much industry standard. It's what investors will look for, and it's what other industry people will look for. And what you see here on the left, in this particular case, the bold are the major milestones, and they have a duration, and then there's sub milestones underneath them. And you can see dependencies. So at the end of setting up verification here on 11.4, it starts then build testing devices, for example, right? So if something moves earlier in this schedule, it'll affect all the schedule downstream. This is generally the format, right? So it's time across the top or bottom of whatever duration, and then major milestones and the dependencies between those. Let's go why they're important. So the Gantt stand for Generalized Activity Normalization Timetable. It is a visual assessment of a plan, and you can see literally the dependencies. You also can find something called critical path. Like this is the part that holds us up there or not. And it allows you to actually resource your project. And it's important on these projects that you actually have an individual. If a team owns it, generally the dynamics of groups lead you to a situation where nobody owns it, right? You say it's the team. It has to be an individual, whether that's inside your organization or outside. It does help you avoid missing items, and it should tie to your budget, right? One thing that you will see when you present something like this to an investor is they will more often than not look at it and say, this is great, but if we gave you more money, could you do it in half the time or something like that? And so a lot of times having the detail around your plan helps you think about where could you compress things and where not. And investors usually are more about time than they are about money. So let me talk a little bit about setting goals, kind of from two different perspectives. So the academic emphasis is very, very different than the commercial emphasis. Generally, the academics, you're trying to maximize your understanding of whatever it is that's going on. It's a lot about new knowledge. How does it work? Why does it work? What are all the mechanisms? Does everyone on the team agree with it? Have we looked at all the different options? And then once we kind of sort all that out, you publish your paper, you document what you do. So it's a lot of work is done on the front side, and a lot of documentation is created kind of on the back side. In the case of industry, it's a little bit different. You have go, no-go decision making. You're trying to minimize your time to market, right? And you're trying to be capital efficient, which means you're trying not to spend a lot of money. So you may not explore every option. You may look for a option. Maybe a good enough option. So a lot of times we talk about minimally viable product, MVP, and that's in the concept of we may not build the absolute best one, but we build one of whatever it is that meets the requirements, whatever those minimum requirements are. And then you're looking to mitigate risk. It may be technology risk, regulatory risk, market risk. So you're trying to take risk off the table. It makes you more investable, and it advances your program. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in value inflection points. But one of the most important differences in this case is you actually document things before you start. So generally you write some sort of document about user needs first, and then maybe specifications. And that's where you start. So the documentation comes on the front side, not the testing, not all the work. The work all comes after you've completed your documentation. And this was, I have to say, when I got my first job out of the university, I went to Siemens, which was, a huge company. And I was responsible, I actually went to marketing, and I was responsible for a very large staff of engineers developing software, a couple hundred. The first thing they asked me to do, even though I knew a lot about software, the first thing they asked me to do was write specifications. And I'm like, write? I don't write. I didn't take writing classes, but that's where you start. And you literally started with a wall of binders full of documentation before you ever engaged and they ever had any of those engineers writing code. So it's just a very, very different approach. So this is an important slide because this is the FDA's view of the world of how you build product, okay? And a lot of times on these, in some of the teams, we'll hear words like validation or verification. These words have formal meanings under FDA and the law. So if you start at the top, it has user needs. That's a document you create. And then based on that, this design input is usually your system requirement specification. So a user need is a very high level document usually. So let's say you were building some sort of like hearing device, like a hearing aid or something like that. The user need might be, it's small, it's comfortable, it's not obtrusive. The design inputs, which go into your system requirement specifications, might be it's 1 inch by 2 inches. It's tan in color. It's got such and such durometer of material to make it soft and pliable, right? So those are the specific requirements. And then you build product to those specifications. When you've reached design freeze, which is a milestone after the design process, you then go into verification. In the verification loop here, you're seeing actually tests your design against that specification. So is it the right dimensions? Does it have the right amplification or whatever those characteristics are? And you literally create another set of documents. There'll be test plans and test reports that verify your design. The next step, and this is a medical device example, goes into validation, where you actually would validate that the product meets user needs. This could be a usability study, it may be a clinical trial. Generally, it ties back to clinical trial type activities, but those tie to user needs. So it's also this loop, but these are what these terms specifically mean when you're talking about building medically regulated product. So where do we start? So there's a lot of inputs. Building medical products and technologies is a bit more complicated than a lemonade stand as a business. So here's kind of the things that I think about as I try to put my plan together. Is what's the technology that we've got? What's the state of IP? What are the indications and claims? These are the things that go to the FDA. When you say, we're going to image breast tumors and be able to, I don't know, in adults over the age 65 or whatever. It also goes in your marketing material. It also goes in your IFUs, your instructions for use. So this becomes super important because more modest claims might give you an easier path through the FDA. More rigorous ones mean you may have to provide more evidence. Years ago, one of the companies I ran manufactured lasers, and it ends up lasers can do lots of things. They can do contact vaporization, non-contact vaporization. They can do heating, and the number of indications is 20 plus for laser. And we would oftentimes go with a really basic indication like contact vaporization. And that's all, just one claim to start to get the product through the FDA and on the market. Now, we couldn't sell it specifically to do prostate ablation or something like that. We couldn't market it. And if that was our target market, that may not have been the best strategy. So you kind of get to choose how rigorous and how aggressive you want to be on your claims. But sometimes being in the market with some product is better than being later in the product with a more rigorous claim. It just depends. And that's one of the considerations you'll look at in terms of strategy. For medical products, the other really big ones, is it reimbursed or not? Who's going to pay for this, right? It could be government, Medicare, Medicaid, for example. And each of those have a specific demographic with them. Private insurance, which covers most demographics, or maybe it's like aesthetics, where if you have Botox, the patient actually pays, and it's not reimbursed by insurance. But that will affect your pricing strategy, your go-to-market strategy. And sometimes it could be all or some combination of these. Sometimes you choose which ones you want to target. And the reason is this: Medicare on average pays about 17% less for a procedure than private insurance. So you may choose to get private insurance coverage and not go for Medicare, because once the price starts to come down, it may continue to go down. And private insurance may start to follow Medicare to a lower price point. And then finally, is it regulated? So in the US, the FDA is the regulating entity. In Europe, it's the notified body that a company has, and it varies by country. That's the Japanese Health Ministry in Japan, which is probably arguably the most challenging and rigorous regulatory entity in the world. But China has their own, as do other countries. In some countries where they don't have a regulating agency, they may use another one as a proxy. So for example, there are countries in the Middle East that don't have their version of the FDA, but they want the product to be registered with the US FDA as kind of a quality measure. So even though it's not their FDA, they want the US's FDA to have a registration for that product, just so they know it's, quote, good. So these are some of the high-level questions that you try to address and build into your plan. And the approach is very prescriptive, right? These are the things you have to do going through this. So if you look at devices and software, what's its classification? The FDA classifies it as class 1, 2, or 3, which is based on safety and efficacy. And so class 1 is the most nominal, like a bedpan. A class 3 device would be a heart valve, for example. A class 2 device is dependent on a predicate. So the idea is, if I was going to use my hearing aid example, if one already exists, I may say that's a predicate. So all I have to do is compare myself to the predicate. I don't have to prove anything fundamental other than I'm similar to something that already exists. There are applicable guidances and ISO standards and ASTM standards and other standards out there that the FDA knows about. You really want to find those and use those, especially the FDA guidances, because they'll tell you what you have to submit and how you go about it. You'll oftentimes do bench testing, and you may use phantoms, and you want to use phantoms that are industry accepted phantoms. You don't want to create your own phantom, because then you have to prove your phantom is valid before you actually use it to prove that your product's valid, right? So you really want to use something that is well recognized and is industry standard. And then animal models, a lot of times you'll do animal testing, but you want to be sure that you use something that the FDA has seen before. So if you're doing heart valves, which is often done with pigs and sheep, you don't want to be using rats to do heart valves or something, or rabbits, right? You want to use something that is kind of the norm, so that it doesn't look like you're creating more risk, okay? On drugs and biologics, it's a very prescriptive process as well. And I'll show you a Gantt chart here in a second of what that looks like. But they usually, again, accepted whatever the small animals or large animals that you use that the FDA has seen before in that indication. You'll do something on formulation. You'll try to figure out if you can scale it. That's one of the questions that often comes up is, I can make 5 grams in the lab, but can I make a metric ton? And how hard is that to do, or how much does that cost? And then the FDA focuses heavily on safety, efficacy, and dose. So these trials go through phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Phase 1 is safety, phase 2 is efficacy, and phase 3 is dose. And this is the process that you must use in going through development. So let's talk about value inflection points. And I stole this chart from Shauna Corey, who used to be with Biolocity, who got it from somebody else that I don't know, but it's not my original work, but conceptually it's pretty important. So if you look from left to right, and the bottom axis is time. If you look at the red curve, which is risk, at the beginning you have your highest risk, right? You've started out, you haven't proven, you haven't built, you haven't really done anything yet. And as you do more and more work, you retire risk, right? It's being mitigated up until the point that you bring the product out at the far right. At the same time, if you look at the blue curve, it has cost. And at the beginning, you haven't spent any money, but as you go to the right, you spend more and more money, and your rate of spend typically rises pretty rapidly as you get further towards the right. What's important to realize is on the green curve, this is a step function. And in investment and in strategics and in dealing with any of these groups, they're looking for milestones, important milestones. So the kind of walkaway message from this is you don't get partial credit. So if you're on the second step here and you get part way through whatever you're doing, but you don't finish it, you don't get credit for it. So let's say at the end of that, you're supposed to be at design freeze or proof of concept, and you don't get to proof of concept, or you don't get to design freeze. That creates a real problem with creating value, because the value only goes up if you hit the milestone, right? It's a step function. So I'll talk about a few of these here in a second of typical value inflection points. So this is like a class 2 medical device. You could have a proof of concept as a value inflection point, design freeze, completing verification, completing validation, filing a 510(k) with the FDA. Could any of these or all of these could be value inflection points for your plan. And this is very, very traditional stuff. And you want to pick value inflection points that people are used to seeing as well, right? You don't want to pick something that's like unique to you that you have to explain every single time. People know what design freeze is, and they know what V and V are, right? And they know what FDA clearance or approval is. You just don't want to pick something that's unusual or very unique. And this is what a development plan would look like if you were pitching to an investor, for example. You can tell I wrote this slide in 2018. Across the top with the little flags are milestones, right? And across the bottom is sort of a Gantt that shows your work. And in the middle, it shows funding. And the way an ask to an investor is structured is typically, I want X amount of money to achieve this. So in this case, I want $120,000 to reach design lock, or I want 1.3 million to get to cash flow positive, for example. So it's really important that you define those milestones because those are what you're going to articulate, and that's what the investors are going to measure you against, right? And in a perfect world, you'll execute this plan and do these things and hit those milestones. So if you're doing therapeutics or drugs, right, these are the typical milestones. A lot of you will be in the therapeutic proof of concept stage and trying to find a lead candidate or two. Usually you have to start with a whole bunch of candidates, and then you have to prove out which is the best. And then you'll go through an IND, and then a phase 1 trial, a phase 2, a phase 3, and then an NDA. The big difference between these therapeutics, though, and devices, especially for the example I showed for like a class 2 device, it's a lot faster and less expensive than taking all the way through on a drug. So what the difference is on the bottom of this. So it may be in the earliest stage on preclinical development. You can do it inside the university. And then it tends to go into a biotech company. And then your funding is going to be in that tens of millions to maybe hundreds of millions range. But ultimately, it needs to be acquired by a large pharmaceutical company in one of those phases of the trial, maybe in phase 2 or phase 3, because it becomes super, super expensive. And it's incredibly difficult for a small company to raise that amount of money and compete in that world. So what you're looking for is somewhere in those latter phases is to be licensed or acquired if you're developing a therapeutic. So this is a typical, and this was an extraction of a project from some years ago, but you can see there's some dependencies here. The first thing is they're going to optimize the formulation, and then they're looking for some leads in here, and then they're doing pharmacokinetics and toxicology, et cetera, and a series of meetings all the way down. As you get to the right, though, the conversations with large pharma should be increasing because it starts to become really, really expensive to get into all this, the latter work on this. And these, the CMOs are contract manufacturing organizations, and CROs are contract research organizations that do a lot of lab tests. So you'll note some of this was done in Emory and some not. And there's certain things you don't want to do inside an academic institution because for statistical reasons and historical reasons. They may have data at the CRO that if an adverse event happens, say with some small animal that makes your data look bad, they can explain it away because they have a database of doing tens of thousands or more small animals of that type. While you may not have that in your lab when you've done a population of 50 rabbits or whatever you've done. So certain things just fit in the university and certain things don't, but it does take outside resources to do pharma development. So here's typical value inflection points that you should think about as you cast your plans. Is my patent, is it issued? Is it filed? Have we completed animal works? Have we reached proof of concept or design freeze? And the concept of design freeze is, this applies mostly to devices. Well, it actually is the same it's the equivalent of a lead in pharma. But you develop a product, you do design and development work until you reach a state that it's complete, right? That you won't change it again. And once you reach that point, you freeze the design and go into verification testing to verify that it meets the requirements that you've designed into it. But what you don't do is work on it and then start verification, then do more work on it, because then you have to start over and you get into a really, really expensive and time-consuming loop. Testing complete would be verification, for example. First in man is a pretty big milestone, especially for class 3 devices. A 510K is for a class 2 device or class 1. And then there's various, you can have IDE for devices or IND meetings with FDA. So having those meetings is considered a pretty big milestone because when you get the question, you're talking to investors and they say, are you in conversations with the FDA? You can say yes, which is a big question. If you show plans and you've never done anything with the FDA, it sometimes can be a challenge because you haven't had the agency take a look at what you're proposing. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about killer experiment. The concept of a killer experiment is the idea of doing an experiment that will end your project. So it is usually something that's of high risk and if you can't resolve the risk, it could kill your project. And if you do resolve the risk, it enables you to go forward. So the idea is you do this experiment or this case, and if your technology doesn't pass, then you kill it. And then you spend your time on something more valuable, because you don't want to spend time on things that aren't valuable. And you want to do the killer experiments as early as you can, so that you don't spend years working on something, then to come to find out it can't work, right? So let's see, here's two examples. If you're building a transcatheter delivered heart valve and the working channel is 16 French, you need to try to create the valve that'll fit inside that 16 French catheter. If it doesn't fit and you can't make it small enough, then you can't deliver it. It doesn't matter, right? Another example is a low-cost glass ceramic material that was used to replace expensive fragile crystals in X-ray equipment, which is a very cool technology. The killer experiment for this was to actually, there's special X-ray phantoms that are used to measure resolution and contrast. And so these experiments were performed using those phantoms to create images and see if they matched or were better, or at least as good as the existing X-ray crystals. And in this case, it wasn't. And in fact, that project was retired. It couldn't reach that resolution and contrast. It was a great technology and super interesting, but it couldn't beat today's X-ray equipment. So it really didn't have a market, because that would be the minimum bar they would have to get through in those cases. We walked through these and these. Okay, so this is kind of where we are at the end. I've walked you through kind of what the milestones are. You need to see if you can figure out what the tasks are with a very high degree of granularity. Full Gantt charts for projects usually have hundreds of lines in them. You need to identify the resources that are going to address each of those tasks. And then you sort out the amount of time that's required. I can tell you, there's this phenomena when you start to do these planning exercises, where when I worked at Siemens and I had 2 full-time project managers and was spending ridiculous amounts of money on development, you'd ask somebody, how long will it take you to do a task? And they would estimate it and then put a buffer of time on top of it. And if you do that, you compound a problem. You'll actually have a project that takes like 3 times longer than it really should. Because the whole time you have your schedule, you're going to have this pressure to try to compress it. And there's going to be slips in places and times. But you really have to resist when you cast your plan of putting in lots of buffer into the plan, or it just becomes kind of a worthless tool. It is important to identify the intertask dependencies. What do you have to do first before you can get to the next task? And then the cost. And a lot, the cost may be internal development based on number of hours worked. It may be from an outside entity where you get a quote from one or more, like testing lab or CRO or something like that. But with those, you can create a pretty good sense of what it takes to build your technology out. And I think that's all I have. I do have one question that was sent in, and I'll read the question. And this question came in, I guess, sometime last week, maybe. But I don't understand the question, so it's really hard for me to answer. So if the person who sent it can clarify, that would help me. It said, what impact can IRB only, not IDE clinical data have in a de novo 510K submission?
I'll keep a lookout in the chat to see if anyone clarifies the question. But while we're waiting for that, there have been a few other questions that have popped up in the chat. One question was, are you willing to share the slide deck?
Yes, I can. It's not top secret. So.
Perfect. So following Today's talk, we are recording it, but we'll also be able to, we'll share a link to the recording and also the slide deck. Another question, I think it was more about the Gantt chart. It says, does this chart look different if you form your own company?
No, it does. You just add, if part of your work is forming a company, you could add tasks for that too. It essentially, whether you form your own company or whether you're in some other company, it really doesn't matter. You're going to need it anyway for investors and to communicate to strategics and to communicate where you are along your development path. So it's the same. It'll have more tasks, maybe. Maybe you have to do company formation, and then you have to go get, set up banking and set up payroll, and we could add some of those operational tasks in here as well. But it should pretty much be the same.
Okay. The next question regarding outside CMO CRO use, is the Biolocity team's appetite the same as, I guess, typically in the VC world?
Is the Biolocity appetite?
Yeah, could you clarify that question a bit, and we'll come back to it. The next question, as you alluded to, full milestone plans can be quite expansive and intensive with hundreds of lines. What level of detail do you build for an early stage investor?
So what you typically do, and I'll go back for a second. To talk to investors, you're about at this level. You might be maybe at this level, but usually you go with the major milestones and not the sub milestones on these. So you might have a detailed one for investors, might have 20 lines, something like that, maybe 30. But this is pretty much kind of the framework. The stuff on the bottom is kind of your Gantt. But this is, this will be in virtually every pitch deck that ever goes in front of an investor. Now it ends up, if you get in front of strategics, which are companies that are in the business, they'll look at this, but they also will likely want to get more detailed. But the way I did it, I cast plans, and it was the detailed plans for us, for my team, right? But for communicating to the outside world, you really can't get in the weeds, right? You lose them, it confuses them. You'll get questions that, it just creates more problems than solutions. So you want to be at a high level for communicating to the outside world, unless people really want to get down a specific topic. One thing I will say though, is if you're at this level here and they ask you to compress it, that's a challenge because you really don't have enough information here to figure out what can I compress. But if you're in something like this, you could look at it and say, well, I could compress the needle height testing or something, I don't know, whatever you're going to adjust here. That's possible if I had more money, because certain things are compressible and certain things aren't, right? And so if you have this level for your own purposes, you can figure out what you can compress. On this, it's pretty hard to say because, it's really hard to say, can I compress how long a 510K submission takes? You can't because it's out of your control. It's up to the FDA, right? So, but if you had maybe your product market launch could go faster if you had more money. But you have to think, you have to kind of get to more granular information if you're going to compress this.
Okay, great. The next question, it's thank you, Brian. Tips on how to bridge the valley of death. Also thoughts on clinical advisory boards.
Yeah, so bridging that value is, it's getting the funding to take you across, right? And so let me do advisory boards first. Here's what I would say, and we see this a lot, and it ends up, this audience here is probably, very academic, and your network, and you know who you know. And what oftentimes happens is, as you look at advisory boards, you tend to reach out to people you know, which tend to be like you. So, doctors tend to reach out to doctors, or scientists reach out to scientists. In your advisory board, you want it to be mixed, right? You'd really like to get some advice, some business advice. And if you're all scientists, you'd like to get an MD or two that could be, might be a user of the technology on your panel. So as you think about that, I think what you really want to do is think about what the mix would be, so you have some balance. Because a lot of times we see advisory boards, and they're large and have great credentials, but they're all kind of the same. The same type of individual again and again and again. And I think what as you think about it, you want some diversity, and you want to get someone who's done it before, so that this isn't all new. And it also gives you credibility when you're talking to investors, because there's a different vernacular that's used, right, when you talk to investors. And how you answer a question in front of an investor is a little different than how you might do it for an SBIR or an STTR or something like that, right? It's a different type of way. So I would encourage you to get a diverse mix, yeah, somebody who's done it before and has a sense of where this all goes. In terms of, all of this has to do kind of on the milestones and bridging. What you really want to be able to do is set some milestones you can achieve and achieve them, because that demonstrates A, you can do it, and B, you've hit one of these value inflection points, which increases your chance of bridging some of this stuff. Because if you haven't achieved them, you're just kind of in a place, right? And Biolocity helps to some extent. The whole point of Biolocity is to help move you to an investable milestone, so that you can get professional investment after this period, right? But I would encourage you to pick your milestones carefully, so that you can demonstrate value, because that's kind of, you just don't want to get caught, along one of these bars where you haven't achieved a milestone. That's just really a bad place to be. And things happen. Things tend to take longer and cost more than, the best plans. So.
Great. The next question is, how do we get assistance to perform these documentations or planning for engineers and researchers that do not have this knowledge or expertise yet?
We help you. I guess in a nutshell. That's why we're doing this. So yeah, I mean, that's what we'll help you through this process, if that's what you're asking, and how to think about it and what to consider and suggest and push on this a lot. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're in the Biolocity funding cycle, this is something that we help through the process. If you are not, we do offer office hours or consultations with our team, so we can also talk to you then. The next question I have is, when planning your budget for each phase of your investment ask, how much financial cushion should you factor into your budget for unanticipated problems or delays?
Yeah, this is like a question that every company on earth, right, wants to know. Like, how do I plan for the unplanned? So I don't know if there's a good quantitative answer. And so here's what tends to happen. If you look at this plan here, for example, it tends to be the things that you're close to in time, you tend to have really good resolution on, right? You're able to say, okay, in the next, 90 days, I'm going to do these things and it'll cost about this. And you probably have a pretty good guess. It's when you start to get out and you say, okay, in 2 years from now, what's it going to cost to do something? And that's when you start to have to make estimates, right? And the ones that tend to be a little bit challenging tend to be, say, around clinical trials. So there's a couple of ways you can do clinical trials. You could, to get a number like that. One way they do in pharma a lot, for instance, is they say price per patient. Okay, you're going to need to do a trial of this magnitude, these many patients, and the cost per patient is $50,000. So it's 50,000 times N is my number. And that gives you a rough estimate your number, maybe higher, maybe lower, but it's a way. There are other ways where if you're closer to it and you can actually, you know, say what the protocol is and talk to a CRO, they'll give you real numbers and you get quotes. When I try to do budgets, especially if I'm using outside resources, I try to get multiple quotes for everything. Knowing that, you know, you're obviously only going to pick one, but it helps me with a sanity check. It also helps me learn, especially if I've never done it before in this space. It helps me learn about the things they think about and they consider, and the questions you get. It'll make you better at doing this. So I would encourage you, for outside resources, try to get multiple quotes. It'll force you to drill down as well, because no CRO is going to quote without a protocol. They won't know what they're doing, right? And then you'll be forced to think about geographies. You'll be forced to think about sites, for example, stuff like that. For design development houses, or if you're going to do like ASTM testing or something on something, yeah, I would get quotes from a couple of different entities. A lot of this is a little bit networking. When you talk to consultants that help on the regulatory side, they'll have a network of resources that you can talk to that can do certain types of testing. Like, so, you know, if you're going to do something in sterilization, you were going to reach out to NAMSA, Nelson Labs, right? You're going to reach out to a couple of the traditionals. They'll know all of those. So this is a little bit about leveraging their contacts, and regulatory is a good place, just because they tend to have regulatory, you know, all that information goes into a regulatory filing. So they tend to know all those things, or those people. So that's what I would do. I can't give you a good answer of how much to over and under on that. It has to do a lot with granularity. How granular can you get to a plan? If you can get, you know, I tend to have big error bars if my guess is more of a guess, and smaller error bars if I actually can say this is specifically what I'm going to do. I know how to do it. And it's purely an implementation. And what I mean by that, there's no risk to it. Like, you know, we're building a new catheter. I've built catheters before. I know how to build a catheter. Okay, I think it'll take this long and cost about this much. I feel pretty good about that. If I've never done it before, I'm going to get some quotes and probably put, you know, I don't know, 15%, 20% around it or something like that. That was a long answer to a short question. But...
Well, we have some more for you. Here's the next one is in a startup, and it's, I guess, a medical device startup that is working or has a working prototype with preliminary positive test results. What systems, for example, software platforms, processes, organizational resource requirements, etc., do you recommend implementing first to start to build the company?
So what you need is a quality system. And there are different software packages. The one I'm most familiar with is Greenlight Guru, but it's probably expensive for you. There are others out there as well. And your quality system is where all of this stuff lives. So those user needs, design inputs, design outputs, all of that stuff lives in your quality system, right? And it ends up when you file a document with an FDA, some subset of this goes into that documentation. The balance lives at your company, okay, in either electronically or in filing cabinets, I guess. And in those cases, yeah, the FDA is going to come in. They come like every 2 years, give or take, and audit you. And they'll come in and you'll put them in a room with no windows, so they want to leave. And they won't accept anything from you, like even a glass of water. And they're going to go through all your documents, right? And that's their job, is to go through all this stuff. So yeah, that's the process. But there are entities we can put you in contact with that can help you with this. Because if you don't know how to do quality systems, me saying it's you know, it's trivializing it, because you have to have some experience about, there's special templates and stuff like that that you need in order to satisfy and, you know, signature processes, etc. But for, yeah, if you're building a medical device, you want to make sure you have these user needs, the system requirement specifications, which are your design inputs and design process, all the stuff documented fully. But we can help you with that. We have some resources.
The next question I have is, thanks for the presentation today. I'm a biomedical engineering PhD student at Georgia Tech and wondered if you have any insights for what the problem identification stage looks like in the very initial phase, even before developing the technologies, so that the final technology can be successfully commercialized, meaning that it satisfies the real needs. I wondered what I, as a student, could possibly do other than just reading literature.
Yeah, so literature is a source. It's a good source. A couple things to think about. We often, and I'll maybe do this from a defect orientation. We oftentimes see teams where, there's bioengineers or whatever, whomever's building a technology, and they might have a doctor friend who gives them advice, but oftentimes the doctor person that gives them advice for their medical technology is a doctor, but isn't an actually potential user for the technology. So, you could have a cardiologist, but if you're building a surgical device, you need a cardiac surgeon. So I, first of all, recognize kind of, as you talk to those that express the gap, right, what the need is, make sure they're the ones that are actually the doers, right, that are in that space. The other thing to think about, and we see this a lot at Emory. So Emory, we can get a lot of input. We build a lot of tools, right, for physicians to use. And that's great, but when I was in industry, and you figured out how do I make something that is really going to work well for the market, not just Emory, you come to realize like academic medical centers are like 5% of the hospitals in the US, right? There's not that many. So if all of your inputs come out of an academic environment or out of published papers, then you may have some challenges for the bigger market, right? If you're building a product that you want everyone to use, your bread and butter may be a 300-bed hospital where their issues aren't about they have the best training, the best knowledge, and all of those things, where their biggest issue is getting patients through and trying to break even as a hospital, right? Where the pressure is on time and throughput rather than on maybe pure excellence, right? Or something like that. So I would think about who the users are and which segments, and if the needs are different between those segments. Because it may be, a local imaging center is going to have different needs than, the X-ray department at Grady, right? If you're building an imaging device. So you need to kind of think about all of those segments and recognize that published papers are largely going to be academic in nature, right? And so you're getting input, but you're getting a type of input. I think what you really want to do is talk to a lot of people, but talk to them in diverse segments so that you at least can get, input from a couple different viewpoints, because it's possible. I've had focus groups where, the people in the focus group didn't agree with each other. That's totally possible because they had different needs. So.
Awesome, thank you. Looks like we just have a few more questions. Your plans here all focus on one product and one plan. I'm wondering to what extent it's important to describe potential hedges like a backup product.
So let me answer two things. When you put these plans together, one of the things that more sophisticated strategics and investors will look for is risks, and then your plans to mitigate the risks. So if you say, okay, this thing's going to be, I don't know, battery powered, and you can't find a small enough battery, then we're going to use compressed air, or I don't know, whatever it's going to be. Backup strategies, and so you literally will create a matrix of risks, and then you can have one or more mitigation for those risks, and you're going to try to address those as early as possible. In terms of multiple products, so what investors want to see And what strategics want to see, once you've kind of picked your technology or your lead therapeutic, they typically talk about focus. And it's better to have one product better sooner than to have 3 products later. The more you talk to investors and strategics, the more time pressure you'll feel, right? And so I would say talking about a second product or a third product can be part of your portfolio, right? And you say, okay, this technology can create a portfolio of different, it can address a portfolio of different indications. Our primary is this first, though. You really want to communicate, we're shooting for this. There are other things. That message then is we're focused, but we do have other markets we can address, which makes the addressable market for the technology larger. But you really want to be able to articulate, this is the one we're shooting for now. This is our entry. This is our starting point. This is our whatever. And once we get to whatever, then we'll start with the other. But you really don't want to articulate a plan usually that runs multiples in parallel, because you'll probably get criticism on focus and time.
Okay, and that looks like it's all the questions for the presentation. We did receive a question of what's the best way? Can people reach out to you directly, or do you have a preferred method that people connect with you, Brian?
Oh, you can reach out to, I guess, everyone in Biolocity. They know where to find me, or just email me. My email is bw7827@gmail.com.
Perfect. So as Brian mentioned, you can reach out to him directly, or I'll leave in the chat. You can schedule a consultation through our group and we can schedule a meeting. So I don't see any additional questions, and we are just at about time right now. So thank you again, Brian, for such a great presentation. Following this meeting, we will again share out a link to the YouTube recording and the presentation. Well, I hope you all have a great afternoon. Thanks.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.